Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity to address Kyiv Security Forum. I will speak today about the nuclear dimension of this war. But before I embark on my remarks, let me just say this. I am no one to speak on behalf of the Ukrainian people, but for what it's worth, I want to thank from the bottom of my heart to all those of you from the United States, from NATO countries, from every country that has supported Ukraine in this hour of need. This is really deeply appreciated. So we all know that Russia's war in Ukraine is a conventional conflict, but it is very much a nuclear crisis. From the very beginning, Russia has prosecuted this war under a shadow of nuclear threats. These nuclear threats, and it should be noted, go well beyond what the Russian military doctrine envisions for permissible use of nuclear weapons and nuclear threats. Those could be summarized in three cases, right? Russia is permitted to use or threaten the use of nuclear weapons in response to nuclear attack against its own homeland, in response to a nuclear attack against Russian nuclear forces, and in a large-scale conventional war when the very existence of the Russian state is in peril. But since February this year, Russia has used nuclear threats in order to prevent direct Western involvement in the war in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side, and Western assistance to Ukraine, and to dissuade Ukraine to continue its counteroffensive. Many analysts and officials are also worried about the risk of Russia's nuclear use, say a tactical nuclear use against Ukraine. And this risk is perceived to increase proportionally with Ukraine's gains on the battlefield. In respect to this nuclear dimension of the war in Ukraine, I'd like to make 3 points. One is that nuclear deterrence is actually proving its value for those who are fortunate to benefit from it. Regardless of Putin's explicit nuclear threats, the United States and NATO would have likely not gotten involved in any direct way on the Ukrainian side because of the fear of nuclear escalation and the belief that any kinetic engagement between two nuclear powers and their alliances greatly increases the risk of nuclear war. That's precisely how nuclear deterrence is supposed to work. And so after 9 months, we see war contained in its original theater, Ukraine, with the two original belligerents, Russia and Ukraine. It has not spilled over, right? Western military aid has been crucial to Ukraine's defenses, but Western stance has been reactive. Ukraine requests, the West delivers. After very careful decision-making and evaluation of each shipment of arms for its escalatory potential. For its part, Russia has not dared to target NATO arms shipments and depots on NATO territory, despite all the Russian bluster and rhetoric. Conversely, however, the crucible of Ukraine is an example of what happens to a country that is not protected by nuclear deterrence, neither of its own or extended by an ally. Ukraine was left in a security vacuum by the post-Soviet settlement. And if power abhors a vacuum, as we learn in political science, that it is no surprise at all that Europe's next major war should erupt in Ukraine. And the big question remains how this security vacuum will be dealt with after this war. The second point is that the war in Ukraine has wide-ranging consequences for the global nuclear order. This is truly a David and Goliath struggle. And whichever side you are on politically, it is difficult not to admire the bravery, the grit, the resourcefulness of the Ukrainian army, and indeed of the whole society. But Western capabilities, resolve, and risk tolerance are on display as well, and are put to the test. If nuclear deterrence is proving its worth, then nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament will be that much more difficult to achieve. And Ukraine's own history of relinquishing a nuclear arsenal inherited from the Soviet Union in exchange for security assurances by a nuclear state, only to be invaded by one of these assurers, is deeply damaging to the credibility of the international non-proliferation regime, to say the least. If, or rather when, Ukraine prevails over Russia, the conclusion might be that nuclear weapons are useless militarily, that even a smaller, less powerful country can win a war against a bigger nuclear-armed adversary. Fine. But none of the tens of thousands of people who perished in this war could be brought back to life. None of the women unraped, and none of the children untraumatized. This is not to speak of the material damage that set Ukraine back decades. And many will ask, what could have prevented this war and suffering in the first place? And to convince countries in a similar security predicament as Ukraine that the answer is not nuclear weapons and is not nuclear deterrence would be that much more difficult. The third point and final point is that the war in Ukraine presents a unique challenge for the West, but also for the entire international community. And that is how to enforce a nuclear taboo without increasing the risk of nuclear war. Ukraine is clearly not a treaty ally of the United States. It is not protected by NATO Article 5 or any mutual defense commitment. It is not a beneficiary of US extended nuclear deterrence. Yet, a violation of the taboo against nuclear use that has held for nearly 8 decades is not something that can or should be taken lightly. And the United States and NATO have impressed in no uncertain terms that any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would spell catastrophic consequences for Russia. But there's ambiguity as to what exactly these consequences might be, what exactly the United States and NATO might be prepared to credibly threaten in order to dissuade Russian nuclear use. Part of the reason is that ambiguity is, at some level, a good thing and presents certain advantages and keeps response options open to be calibrated to the scale of offense. But a greater part of this ambiguity is the genuine difficulty in determining what exactly the United States and NATO might be prepared to do in response to Russian nuclear use, in such a way as not to increase the risk of nuclear war between Russia and NATO. All the while, the world is watching, including US adversaries, US allies, and potential proliferators, and thus the value of nuclear weapons in world affairs is now being decided. I'll end here. Thank you.